So hi, my name's Rob Kieschke, and I'm going to be talking today about digital transformation, particularly in the perspective of how that feels in a big company and how that feels in a big traditional company. And really the question I'm posing is why does this seem so difficult? And hopefully I'll be talking or helping you a little bit in the sense of what can we do about it. So a little bit about me before I really get going. I spent 32 years working at 3M. I just left 3M. And of course, 3M is one of the most innovative companies on the planet. And I've been very privileged in sort of riding along again for 30 plus years in a lot of sort of very innovative programs. So let me walk through some of those. I was actually hired, oddly enough, to work on a new military air engine material. My background is actually material science, and titanium particularly. And so we spent a while working on that F-35 engine. And even though our material was probably a little bit too sophisticated for that engine, we learned a tremendous amount, a lot of fun working for the military, actually. Then I flipped and worked on what I would call energy materials. We actually turned some of the technology from that aerospace project into a very high performance power cable. And then we started to look at the emergence of very large composite structures like this wind blade and what we could do to actually help the durability and manufacturing ease of those structures. Then I flipped again and had a lot of experience working with these folks. You're familiar with this cell phone manufacturer. We ended up developing a lot of materials which not only bond this phone together, but actually help produce the display lamination, its color, its efficiency, and its durability. And that's an experience working with a very leading edge, very demanding customer. Then I spent quite a bit of time thinking about how the company innovates, whether we could actually codify that innovation process and teach it back to the company, which we actually did. And I moved into a number of, let's say, new business development and strategy jobs where we were really looking in a very greenfield sense, what should we be doing that we weren't doing already? And then finally, and this tees up this talk, is I ended up being the senior director for software and AI research in the company and had a pretty substantial team of people with those skill sets. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about how could I apply the learning in the previous jobs into this, obviously this new field, an emerging field of development. So this is what I think about a lot. I look at digital capability largely being huge, amazing things that are possible. And yet, just to lay the background here, when I go to these conferences like the MIT Initiative of the Digital Economy, and I watch economists talk about why haven't we seen a significant impact on the gross domestic product of the country yet? So much capability and such little financial impact. Yes, there's a lot of news stories. Yes, there's a lot of capability that's talked about, but really to make an impact on the country, we've yet to see that. And so having worked in a large traditional company, I started to think about, well, why is this? And again, another IDE conference, a roundtable, a number of speakers say things like, well, traditional companies need to be bolder, they need to take bets, and they need to make some mistakes. And to me, I'll use an analogy here. It's a little bit like telling someone to lose weight, because telling them to eat less and exercise more, everyone knows that. That's not the hard part. The hard part is actually doing it. And going back to this statement, I think companies do know they need to be bolder. They do know they need to take bets. They do know they need to make mistakes. Something is stopping them doing this, right? So what is that? And at this point, you may say, well, why would we have large companies wanting to sort of undergo a digital transformation? And I'm trying to depict on the left there that big companies have a huge amount of assets. They have factories, they have people, they have large R&D budgets. They have an incentive to innovate. And yet it's hard. right? So moving from that left picture to the right picture, it's very tempting to say, well, all you have to do is produce this digital product. The solution may not be physical. That actually has a tremendous advantage if you think about it. We don't have to manufacture it. We can scale it more easily. We're not limited to raw material supply. We can distribute it more easily. We're not limited to distribution channels. And we actually have a smaller environmental footprint because we're not consuming stuff and that stuff doesn't get thrown away. On top of that, when we start working with cloud service providers like AWS and Microsoft, they are very, very capable and more than willing to help us. And so again, why isn't this an easy transformation? So I think, and this is not an exhaustive list, but I think these four tend to hit what I've experienced as being the biggest issues. First of all, the senior leadership, and you have to get senior leadership involved. If you think about how they became senior in the company, it was because they were the most invested in the old way of doing things. And so now asking people who've gotten to where they are through an old way of doing things, now to flip into a completely new way of doing things, that's very difficult. It's almost analogous to someone cutting off the branch they're sitting on, right? So it's going to be difficult for them to do that. I'm reminded of a story, actually. One of the senior VPs, we were chatting about a digital business model, and it was based on another product. Actually, the product would have been self-sufficient financially on its own, and I was suggesting using the data to create a service for a completely different set of customers. And he said, "I'm not sure that'll work." And the funny thing was, I completely agreed with him. I wasn't sure it would work either. But to him, that was a reason not to do it. To me, that was a reason to try it. And I think this kind of reticence is very prevalent in large companies and something you absolutely need to be aware of. I have a potential solution coming up, but something you've got to be aware of. So next one over. Again, companies, particularly materials companies like the one I worked for, they're very used to a certain investment profile, relatively modest at the beginning, much more investment required when we're manufacturing something. And so that small at the beginning, large at the end, matches actually the confidence you get when you start to scale a product. You gain confidence as you do it, and therefore the investment actually matches the confidence. With a digital product, you have to invest earlier, and that represents a bigger risk to many companies. How do you know that'll work? That's the question that keeps popping up. It is, next one over, it is super hard to hire, lead, motivate, and retain digital talent in a company that it doesn't have a obvious digital brand. Typically, we have to hire these folks at a high skill level. We have to compensate them perhaps more than a traditional industrial chemist. That's difficult for HR to deal with. When we try and promote these folks, they don't have the same kind of track record in the company than that sort of, let's say, more traditional industrial chemists have. It's tough, and you almost need to attack the HR problem first, to be honest. Are we going to really create an environment which is going to motivate and attract people and keep them? Very hard to do, and our turnover rates were always quite high because of that. And lastly, this is a really intriguing one. In my experience, digital solutions tend to actually be applied to the wrong problems. They actually apply to obvious problems, but the problems don't actually have the biggest value. It's a strange thing, and I'll walk through an example of that. Okay. So yes, a dramatic picture of a jet engine, sort of where I started with the company on the left, obviously. And what I'm trying to illustrate here is that materials problems like this one, which is essentially trying to say, how do we make a jet engine more efficient? And if you look over there on the right, you'll see the hot part of the engine, which is the turbine. The efficiency of a gas turbine engine is almost directly related to the temperature you can run those materials at. And down there on the right, the little triangles and squares and little crosses down there, they are specific materials developments, and this happens to be for a Rolls-Royce engine. And you'll see the temperature of those things is gradually creeping up, and it's taken 50, 60 years to do this. If you can increase that material temperature capability by, let's say, 50 degrees C, that is a huge deal. And so In the materials world, you have a very well articulated target, and the difficulty then is creating a material that does that. In the digital world, it's almost flipped on its head. You have a lot of capability and a struggle to find a really profitable application to throw that at. That is very uncomfortable. And so a non-well articulated target that has very well-known value to it can be an issue, certainly for a company like 3M. Okay, so this is something I mentioned earlier. The chart there represents the red one, what a materials development program might look like. They sync cost, so the y-axis is cost, and negative dollars represent an investment. And so you invest for a while, you launch the product, you get a positive rate of return, and you enjoy the fact that the area under the curve on the positive side is substantially bigger than the area under the curve on the negative side. When you go into a digital investment, you instantly have to hire a large team. That's a problem. And you start investing dramatically with an outcome that could be slow because the company doesn't know how to scale it. And the return could be uncertain because it's like something we've never made before. Okay, so financially, this looks odd. Now, the wrong problems, I floated that out earlier. We tend to apply digital technologies to the wrong issues. I was particularly sort of inspired, I suppose, by reference in this book on the right, Machine Platform Crowd by McAfee and Ring-Jorgensen. They talked about early electrification of cotton mills, and the picture on the left there is a cotton mill around 1900, and you'll see lots of weaving machines powered by belts and pulleys. Traditionally, this was a large steam engine based outside the factory, and the early days of electrification, right around 1900, all they did was move an electric motor into the same spot as the steam engine with the same power, and they saw a minor gain in productivity, probably because the electric motor was slightly more efficient and they didn't have to ship coal in there anymore, but the inside of the factory remained identical. And only when they put smaller, more custom-made electric motors on each loom, in this case, they could run them independently, obviously a lot safer, they probably put them closer together, did they see a massive productivity improvement. Now, that's a good story. The shocking part is it took 40 years for them to realize what they should have done with electrification in this particular mill. And that seemed to me to be very analogous to what we're seeing in digital. We see, certainly we have applied AI algorithms to, for example, trying to identify the right sales rep for a particular inquiry. Now, that might sound really cool, but in fact, when you start looking at the problem, we kind of didn't have an issue doing that. And the fact that the AI algorithm was essentially non-explainable led to sufficient distrust that the group that we essentially delivered that to didn't even use it. And so the impact was so modest and the uncertainty associated with the solution was enough that it ended up being no value. Okay. So here's what I suggest we could do about that, and here's what I spent, many years doing, is trying to identify what I called really high friction problems. High friction, a lot of awkwardness that I felt as a digital could significantly overcome, therefore would give high value, right? Those high friction problems tend to be not only big, but somewhat vague in terms of what the solution looks like. So what you need to do is identify a really high value problem and then some incremental value approach paths. In other words, can we generate a stepping stone like approach? We hop from one rock to the other, going towards this very high value opportunity. And then each stepping stone represents incremental value that can convince the company that this is worth pursuing, right? So you've got a quick win kind of approach. You provide proof points, which convinces executives you're on the right track or this is real. And you also get permission to sort of generate a team, which, and I talked about microculture here, you can infuse a culture which is appropriate for digital. The rest of the company doesn't do this, by the way. The rest of the company thinks they're agile, but they're not. What happens then is that when the company looks at this microculture being successful, everyone wants to emulate it. Much more effective doing that, in other words, an invitation to participate, than a high-level edict, okay? So the other thing, a couple of points I mentioned here, cloud service providers, AWS and Azure, I've worked closely with AWS, are extremely capable and very willing to help implement the foundational services which will allow you to pursue the application. So it's almost as if the cloud service providers are basically being the factory or the scale-up mechanism for the future application. And I've certainly found the relationship to be extremely synergistic. And if you think about AWS and Azure, they get paid if you use services, if you use instances, and you store data, okay? Large companies really are not good at that anyway. So if you use them, they get paid. If you don't, you don't get paid. And to me, this is an ideal relationship. Cloud service providers are creating tools, waiting for someone to pick up and use them. And large enterprises have that opportunity only if they knew what to do with them, right? The last point there is, even though what I've talked about mostly is bottom up, in other words, empowered teams that can create some options, you do need an executive sponsor. And I found a sort of combination of inspiring and or generating paranoia is the best way to do this. In other words, look at the opportunity, but also look at the issue. If we don't pursue this and our competition does, look at how we'll be threatened by that, right? That's the paranoia piece, okay? So let me give you a couple of examples, 3 in this case. So in my world, being a materials company, materials development is breathtakingly slow. Most materials are derivative, in other words, they're based on something you've done before, but if you actually have to develop an entirely new solution, like the aero engine material, it takes about a decade to develop. And you may say, why? And it's primarily because materials development is a sort of two parameter at a time iterative optimization process. And in reality, you've got to go through at least 10 to 20 parameters. So you optimize 2 and then you introduce a third one. You've got to go back to the beginning again and optimize for that, and then optimize for that, and the next one, and the next one, and the next one. And it is a sort of painful path over hyperdimensional space. And because we are human beings and we can't imagine hyperdimensional space, we find this tedious and slow. Okay, so the prospect is if we can use digital to accelerate materials development, that is a big deal. And this is not just a matter of convenience, this is a matter of competitiveness. If our competition can develop a material in a year instead of 10 years, they will win before a traditional company even knows what's happened, okay? The second one, which is, even though I'm passionate about the materials development side, the second one is even more exciting, which if you look at manufacturing, and 3M manufactured a lot of stuff, there's a lot of underutilized capital. And there was a lot of equipment that's very expensive that isn't making stuff quite a bit at a time, actually. And I'll go through this in a little bit more detail later on. But I think we should set ourselves the goal of essentially utilizing that in-place capital about twice as well as we do now. And again, 2x might sound modest, but for a company that makes, in 3M's case, $30 billion of materials, if you can all of a sudden make $60 billion with almost the same physical assets, that is a huge deal. And then you scale up that to a nation state and you say, okay, this is a major impact on the nation state level and certainly GDP level. So, and I actually think this is feasible. And the last one, again, for a company that makes traditional products, having non-physical solutions, I think is an untapped opportunity. Okay, so I'll walk through some of these in a bit more detail. So materials development or materials informatics, and again, I talked about this 2 parameters at a time operation. And the other thing about it is it's largely done by a single individual or maybe a couple of people. This isn't really a team effort, even though we'd love to think it is. So what I proposed is, and this sounds breathtakingly simple, but in that same sense, it's shocking how frequently this is not done, is take the materials development data and put it into one place. Usually, and I know we're not alone here, this data is sitting around in Excel spreadsheets, and you immediately start to see Excel spreadsheets really lend themselves to two-dimensional sort of view of things, even though that's not really the case. Yes, the vast majority of data is sitting on Excel spreadsheets. It is only interpretable by the author. Excel is a wonderful tool, but its customization tends to make it non-easily interpretable by other people. And so getting a standard format, getting the data into one place is a huge actually task, and it's massively powerful. Giving everyone access to that, again, sounds super basic. It isn't done. Just doing that, I estimated, would accelerate our development speed by about a factor of 2. If you look at the time it takes for a new team to become proficient in an area that another team, might be the other side of the world, has already done, it will accelerate things by about a factor of 2. Okay, twice as fast. And now we go from 10 years down to 5. Just visualizing the data, just taking that data and being able to show it in a form where you can understand, you can interpolate, you can extrapolate, is also massively powerful. Now, none of these things actually require a lot of AI, a lot of modeling, and they are very basic, and they are largely not done at the moment, okay? So only when I go to this point am I saying, okay, so now we introduce some, let's say, more sophisticated approaches, some AI, or maybe some more physics-based modeling, or a combination of the two, which actually I think is the most powerful. And we start doing things called forward predictive modeling, where we start with a formulation or a composition and predict performance, which can be done now if you know enough. And certainly if you start building that data set and the relationships between formulation and performance, you can build those models pretty easily. This is, again, it's not invention. It's just a matter of slugging through and doing it. Even more exciting is what is known as the reverse problem, where we start with properties and we try and predict formulation. That is starting to look feasible. Obviously much more difficult, but that in a sense is the holy grail. The customer comes to us and says, we would like this performance. If we can actually identify essentially a starting point or a sweet spot, this is massively accelerating. And I anticipated there would at least be another factor of 2 in the visualization and modeling area. And then finally, if we start to automate experimentation, again, very feasible. It's a significant investment, obviously the capital, but essentially robotic experimenters who can not only work 24 hours a day, but actually do things like slope climb, where the robot is essentially building a response surface and probing that response surface to look and identify whether something is a local maxima or a global maxima. This is massively accelerating as well. So another factor of 2 there. And when I proposed this, I sort of instantly realized that there's enough fur around those numbers, about 2, that those multiplied together was approximately 10, which is why I suggested that we should be aiming to accelerate materials by a factor of 10. In other words, 10 years to 1 year. I still believe that's pretty feasible. Now, at this point, I realized that the large company didn't have a sense of humor, because they kept saying, well, don't you realize that 2 by 2 times 2 is only 8? And I'm like, yeah, I get it. But it was kind of fun, I thought. But anyway, a little side note that often executives don't see that humor. Okay, so manufacturing. Look at the way manufacturing processes are identified. It's actually shockingly straightforward. A engineer in this case will obviously have a goal to produce a manufacturable set of conditions, a product that is manufacturable. They'll go through some work to identify the conditions in the factory that generate that. And the primary feedback here, the primary thing that locks in those conditions is really reproducibility. So a number of runs that have been within some tolerance, the same. And as soon as that's achieved, again, you've got tremendous pressure to sort of deliver this as soon as possible. That manufacturing process will be locked in, and they will start making stuff, okay? Now, a lot of these products have been made for many, many years. And if you start now looking at the evolution of that manufacturing process, because it is changed occasionally, it is actually improved over the life cycle of the product. And let's say over a decade, you'll find that the what's called the scheduled and unscheduled downtime. This scheduled downtime is when they will close the factory down to clean it. Unscheduled downtime is when something will break or something will go wrong and they've got to close the plant. That's typically improved by perhaps 25%. In other words, at the end of 10 years into making something, there will be 25% less downtime than the beginning. Similarly, the quality, in other words, if you're making material that doesn't meet the quality spec, that's essentially trash, so that time is wasted. That's about another 25%. And the line, or whatever you're using to make this product, typically accelerates. It's going faster by 25 to 30%. And if you start to add those numbers together, or multiply them together rather, you start to see that we're about twice as good at making something at the end of the campaign, that was 10 years down the road, than at the beginning. And so the question we would pose is, well, if we had, rather than this approach of sort of looking for 3 runs that happen to be the same, or a number of runs that happen to be the same, if we had a model that would predict and optimize, the machine would essentially start to run itself. There's no reason why we couldn't get these improvements almost immediately, or perhaps within a few months of starting manufacturing. That's where you start to see the 2x utilization coming from. Okay. So what do you have to do this? So unlike materials development, manufacturing actually has a lot of data. The problem is the data often doesn't relate to the product quality. It's kind of interesting. So if you have an oven, you might have 20 to 30 temperature measurements in the oven, all of which are the same. And we may see a manufacturing data set with, let's say, 30 to 50 independent variables, only 7 of which actually relate to product quality. Okay, so the first thing is start to really understand which variables, which isolated variables actually influence product quality. Again, manufacturing is largely geared up towards doing things the same as we did last time, not doing things as well as they could be. Okay, we have the opportunity to gather lots of data. That sounds easy. The problem is, and I'll highlight this in a second, that manufacturing is amazingly conservative. They don't want to change anything, or if they do, it's changing it very slowly. The other thing they're paranoid about is actually access to the network. So you may actually have to, oddly enough, have to build a parallel network on a separate, essentially completely isolated from the main plant, to avoid, in quotes, contaminating or potentially contaminating the plant network. Oddly as it sounds, that's a quicker way than trying to hammer your way through IT. The next thing, online product measurements. What do I mean by that? Very typically, quality isn't actually measured at the manufacturing point of manufacture. It is measured sometimes hours or perhaps even days later when you're doing these slow quality tests, which are a little bit archaic. And so you don't know if you've made anything that's any good. The only thing you know is it was made the same as last Tuesday until, let's say, a day or so later. Now, some of these, the reason it's done like that is because these things are really hard to measure online. So the push then is to measure something which can be correlated with, at least semi-qualitatively or semi-quantitatively, with the product of interest. If you make an adhesive, measuring adhesion is very slow and difficult. But what you need to figure out is then, can we measure something like degree of cure, for example, which is measurable and we know relates to adhesion in some way, and then train a model to actually tell us what the variation in degree of cure can be to actually still achieve the product requirements. And strange to say, then we need to be able to measure something where the direction of goodness is at least the same as the product. Okay. Without that online measurement, as unrelated as it may be to the final product quality, you have no hope of really generating this closed-loop model. Now, once you've got that, then you can start to say, okay, can we really develop a closed-loop control model which will make the machine run itself, make the machine self-optimize? And for example, something I haven't mentioned yet is that raw materials are always going out of spec. They're always varying in their inequalities, and the machine should be able to actually deal with that itself. So this is a very real possibility, not easy, because manufacturing is very resistant to change. I do think it's probably the biggest opportunity we have. But again, changing manufacturing folks are very resistant to change. That's the bad news. The good news is manufacturing is actually already a black box. No one really fully understands how the machine works. They just know if it worked last week, it's going to work this week as well. And so that issue of AI explainability, do we have to explain how the model's working, is perhaps less of an issue because no one really understands how manufacturing works anyway. That's the kind of good news. Okay, a little tongue in cheek, but it is good news. Okay. Let's finally then, non-physical products. In other words, can traditional companies start to sell things that are not stuff? And I firmly believe we can. It is difficult to accept. And again, little story, I was talking to one of our business development folks about essentially selling access to an algorithm which will predict composite performance with a random array of fibers, right? And this person kept saying, well, when do we sell the composite? And I had to keep saying, we don't sell the composite. We sell access to a model which predicts someone else's performance. And they just couldn't get their head around it. So it is hard for some of these folks to understand that you're selling something which isn't touchable, okay? So even though I can articulate through, again, reasoning or through comparison to other businesses, a very attractive scale-up opportunity, certainly compared to physical. We don't have to be reliant on a factory. We don't have to be reliant on raw materials, for example, or distribution. It is a tough sell unless you've already done it. So having proof points where we've done it and it's worked and nothing's gone wrong is super important. So that goes back to that stepping stone idea. How can we generate little steps along the way? Okay, so I'm going to elaborate on this on the next slide, but the one thing I was interested in was, can we piggyback on an existing physical product sale? In other words, can the physical product generate data which can be formed into a virtual product and sold to a completely different market? I actually do think that's feasible. Okay, so again, that's one of the solutions. Obviously, use data from existing product line to create a new solution. In quotes, it's free. That's free data, and we can create something. Now, the tougher sell here is to keep that let's try it culture going in the company, okay? And often, even though the cost to create that solution could be substantial, I think we need to reinforce the fact that if the product doesn't work, so the example I gave earlier about the senior executive who was concerned about something not working, and I said, let's try it. If it doesn't work, we can just stop it. That's not true in a physical product. In a physical product, you've already invested in that infrastructure. You've already got Marcom out there. You may have actually got product sitting in warehouses or even sitting in the customer's facility. It's tough to actually pull it back. With a virtual product, it's easier to turn it off. So the cost of failure could be close to zero. And again, traditional companies kind of don't get that. They have to learn that. Okay. So in summary then, actually, I'm super optimistic that digital companies' capabilities will be connected to these really high value problems pretty soon. Lots of companies working on materials informatics, lots of materials informatics service providers springing up. I do think this will happen. To me, it was frustratingly slow, but I'm confident it will happen. And with that, I think we will see some real GDP impact pretty soon. Now, the one thing that I haven't mentioned yet, and something I think about as a citizen, is productivity. Again, part of what we're seeing now, everyone's concerned about inflation. Part of that inflation is wage inflation, which is really coming from the fact that most economies have too few employees, right? They can't get enough people. So you look at a declining birth rate in Europe, that's been going on for a while, declining birth rate in the US, obviously the baby boomers are now retiring, and now we're starting to see a declining birth rate in China. So the lack of employees is really an opportunity for some of these solutions to help. I personally think the mass displacement of jobs is unrealistic. It's not really going to happen. I think we really need to look at these things as being tools that could help everyone be more productive. So I'm very happy that some of these things are popping up to me right at the right time. And finally, I've spent a lot of time talking about this issue. I think a lot of voice, a lot of chatter about technical issues. I think certainly my experience at a large company, the cultural issues far outweigh the technical issues. I think a lot of what I talked about is pretty feasible. Getting the company to really commit and invest and believe in this kind of big bet has been the largest issue. That's obviously at the senior executive level, but I think even at the worker level, there's been a lot of reticence and a lot of, kind of language like, I hope it'll go away, at the researcher level, rather than a true embracing of these future technologies. So with that, again, I hope I've ended with an optimistic note, and I hope I've given you some idea about what digital transformation is like in a large company. So thank you.